Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today is February 16th, 2021. My name is Jeffrey Mullen.
Sir, I can give you the content right now.
Thank you. We're all ready with
I'm the acting. I'm only doing one Zoom call at a time. I'm the acting chair of the comprehensive permit hearing for 582 Blue Hill Avenue. This is a continuation of a hearing that began on December 10. My name is I'm Jeffrey Mullen. I'm with me is Frank O'Brien and Giselle Joffer, members of the board. Tonight we've scheduled the peer review summary and presentation from the board's peer review consultants on traffic and safety and on design. But before we start, I'd like to recognize Milton's town planner, Tim Zawinski, who's got a couple of updates for us. Mr. Zawinski. Mr. Zawinski? Bev, is he on mute or?
He is on mute.
But that's his control.
Okay.
Slight delay, but now she's able to talk.
Okay. Mr. Zawinski, are you with us? All right, maybe we'll return to Mr. Zawinski. Tonight, the main purpose of tonight's hearing is the peer review for project design and traffic and safety. And I see that both of the peer review consultants are with us. I'd like to recognize the peer review consultant for the site and design, Mr. Bomer. Welcome to the Board of Appeal.
Well, I'm the design. Bomer is the design reviewer, not the traffic.
Right, and we recognized you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me turn my camera on. I somehow thought that architecture was going to be second. So
We could do architecture second if you prefer.
no, it makes no difference.
Okay.
The
Mr.
only
Bomer.
difference might be, Mr. Chair, that traffic may not take as long, but it's totally up to you.
Well, we hear from Mr. Bomer. He's
That's fine.
Okay.
ready to go.
I hope all of you had, I did write a report, a memo
Thank you.
that I hope you saw. And I'm not going to drag you through that word for word. Probably the summary at the very end, the last 4 or 5 lines, kind of encapsulates my feeling about the development. And I think I developed this opinion kind of early on in reviewing the materials. I think probably as compelling as anything was the image, the 3-dimensional images that were produced by the planning department and circulated twice. I think they did a second letter in January that included some of the same imagery. And it was very clear from early on that typical strategies that designers employ for mitigating the impact of projects that we all know are going to be bigger than context. It was clear from that imagery that, in my opinion, there was really no way to mitigate the impact of this development on the neighbors. And of course, in a setting like this, it isn't just the immediate neighbors, the project, and I do urge all of you to refresh your memory of that image that was produced by the planning department. And unfortunately, I wasn't made aware of any imagery that three-dimensional imagery that the proponent produced that showed context adequately to really help understand the impact that this project has. So again, very early on, it was clear that this is a project that really couldn't be mitigated. The scale of it was so far out of the context that strategies that we all use as architects, and I design a lot of buildings that have to fit into context as well. It just is not possible with a project of this scale. And with that, that fact, and again, I'm sort of summarizing the last 4 or 5 lines in my report, that fact combined with the requirement to destroy the historic home and gardens, in my mind, made a really compelling case that while this is a site that, and I stated it in the report, that I think it is possible to develop a successful multifamily 40B project, and I truly do believe that, the fact that this particular strategy takes such a toll on a resource that has an impact. You know, I was first talking about impact just on neighbors and people who drive by the site, but the impact of the loss of that site, the loss of the historic fabric, it was another aspect of the project that couldn't be mitigated. There's no way to mitigate the loss of that cultural resource. So from day one, it was very clear to me that this wasn't a matter of reviewing the building. There are issues with the building that I think are serious, kind of normal issues of connectivity with the landscape. You know, this building is built up on a plinth, a tall plinth, that, and the site has been graded higher to receive this plinth so that the garage floor level works. So while there was some outdoor space provided in that courtyard, which certainly I think as a rooftop courtyard is pleasant, but that was really the only exterior usable outdoor space. I think the project didn't grasp and try to deal with the issue of the site being isolated from a pedestrian perspective. The plans failed to even show a connection, a sidewalk connection to the road, nor did it propose off-site improvements that might help connect the 118 units to some of the smaller scale residential areas where people could walk and enjoy being able to walk and have a pedestrian experience. I think the lack of active play space with 118 units, and I believe it was 70 of the units have either 2 or 3 bedrooms. So we know there are going to be numerous children in the development that really would be disadvantaged, and I think would have to be driven anywhere to have any regular ongoing outdoor experience. So essentially I think the kind of heartbreaking conclusion was that there is no way to fix this proposal, in my opinion. And I respect Mass Housing's notion that the site is generally suitable for residential development. I actually agree with that, but I think the current proposal really is not taking advantage of the on-site resource that could be a tremendous amenity for the residents of this development to have access, permanent access to the history and cultural significance of the site. I do think in my opinion, plans do need to include space that is, certainly anything of this scale needs significant outdoor active recreation space as well. So I think you'll notice in my report, I really didn't spend a lot of time talking about the architecture. That's frankly, I do a good many of these reviews, and I think it's really important to get the site strategy nailed down before digging into talking about, again, what the reveal on the clapboards is. So I think that essentially the ultimately my conclusion was, if you believe in the importance of the preservation of the cultural aspects of the site, and if you believe that that you do want to develop the site in a project that is inevitably going to be larger than the context, then in order to create a project on the site where it really is possible to use conventional mechanisms for mitigating the scale of a project that is bigger than its context, my conclusion is that 118 units is not possible on this site and satisfy those dual requirements of having a project that can be made to responsibly fit into the neighborhood and preserve the cultural importance of the site. This is a very, I won't go into there are a couple other fine details that would, or even important details that always get worked out as a project develops. I didn't really go into a great laundry list of all those. I think and I'm sure you've all read the civil engineers report and their concerns about stormwater management on the site, which is rendered extremely difficult, if not impossible, because of the footprint of the building and not having adequate area for dealing with stormwater other than within the footprint of the construction itself. So to me, I think, as I said in my very last line in the report, I think there's just some really, really big problems with this proposal from a design perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Bomer. Let me ask my colleagues if they've got any questions. Ms. Jaffer.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Mr. Bomer, and there you are. And thank you very much for your review. You mentioned that, I think, the scale of the project makes it difficult to employ the typical mitigation strategies to reduce the impact on neighbors, which is something I'm very interested in. What are those typical mitigation strategies that could be employed, for example, with a smaller development?
Well, it's usually about scale. If it's scale of the building and then modeling impact once you've established the scale. For example, shadow impact, and shadow is created by the massing of the building. And if you're concerned about the shadows you're casting on your neighbors, generally you can distribute the massing of the building in a way that will at least mitigate, if not eliminate, shadow impact. Similarly, in this development, for example, let's just say that it would be okay to put a building. Now, my opinion, but let's just say that the strategy or the justification for a building of this scale is that it could be hidden from the street, so then nobody would know it was there, because the public realm matters as well as the immediate abutters, for sure. And in that case, you might say, well, we need to provide an adequate buffer area, a landscape buffer zone, or use berms, plantings that aren't just walls that create actual interest in foreground, in a way that it feels natural and fits in. I pointed out in my report that in this development, there was parking in front. So if the strategy were to hide the building, because obviously it's of a very, very different scale, then that doesn't work in this current design because there isn't enough space in front of the building to really create a landscape that would, in an interesting fashion, help to screen it. And they're kind of stuck with a building with this footprint. They can't really push it further down the hill. That diminishes even more space. So when I reach the conclusion that this isn't a mitigatable project, it's because it's so locked in because of its scale. You will notice that on the west or the east side of the building where it's going down the slope, they did lower the level. It's typically 4 stories on top of the plinth, but it did drop down to 3 stories in the last, 80 feet or so as it approached the neighbors. But at the same time, the plinth exposed itself. The parking garage, the wall of the parking garage rises up. So it was still a 4-story facade on top of raised grade. And I think the civil engineer made a similar point in the sense that the project is so big that he can't figure out, the peer reviewer could not figure out a credible way to deal with stormwater. And it is a relatively steeply sloped site. So stormwater is a real deal here, and making sure that you're not impacting. This is another mitigation strategy, but with water instead of building form. So that I think that's fair to read into the civil engineer's report, that he was also concerned that there was no way to mitigate the stormwater impact of this development.
Thank you. In your report, you also make a comparison to, I think it's sort of the length of a typical parking garage in the Boston area. And that was interesting to me because I'm trying to get a grasp on sort of how a building of this size feels, right, neighbors. Could you talk a little bit more about that comparison and the point that you were making?
Sure, and the context that I was speaking of specifically is in Boston's South End, and the roads that run, the roads are a little bit crooked there, but essentially the east-west roads, Tremont Street, Columbus, the grid that makes up the South End, the east-west dimension of those blocks is on the order of 200 feet. And interestingly, many of those blocks historically were developed with 4-story buildings that included a mansard roof at the top floor. So the scale is actually quite similar. I will say they're not comparable in many, many ways, but because this building also has, it has some short ends on it, but even if facing the road, but even if you subtract those ends, I think that central portion is still at least 200 feet long. But that's the size of the building, about the size of those buildings in the South End that have a mansard roof.
Okay, thank you.
Again, I think I'd say those images created by the planning board, if those are accurate, and I believe they probably are, I think they really tell the story that about context. That combined with the architectural site plan also is very revealing, but strictly with footprint. And you get a really good sense of how big the residential footprint is, not to mention the parking garage that's significantly larger than the residential footprint.
Thank you. With respect to historical preservation or lack thereof, are you familiar with developments of a comparable size that have incorporated older buildings? So comparison points.
Well, that's a good, yes. Well, I'll start with things that I know very well because I've done them myself. Adaptive reuse is an extremely well-established method for preserving historic buildings. And a big building, well, I did one on the Cape that turned a large building into 7 apartments. And so there are many ways to reuse buildings, and in fact, many funding sources that support those activities as well. So it is common. This site, I think what was interesting is I think it's entirely possible to develop the site largely along the road's edge. It could even be an L-shaped building, the long axis going north-south. It could still have an underground garage. And in my opinion, I think you could develop a scheme that would preserve the existing building and the gardens and integrate the development into something that would be really special.
My final question, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues. In the application, the developers suggested that they would pay homage to the original structure and the design of the building, which I, as a non-expert, didn't quite see. And in fairness to the developer, they did say that's something that they're continuing to look at. From an architectural perspective, do you see those similarities? And I guess, again, do you know of sort of maybe comparable buildings that may be designed more closely to sort of the period and style of the original building?
I'm going to try to not be snarky when I answer this question, but to me, it's like saying Versailles, it relates to a little French chalet or something. It's the scale is so extraordinary on this building, even compared to the mansion that it would be replacing. I've seen people use the strategy of salvaging some of the materials from buildings that have to be demolished, historic buildings that have to be demolished, sometimes salvaging, precious ironwork and integrating that into gates and, around the building. There are ways of preserving elements, but I think in this particular building, given its scale, I wouldn't know how to make a connection that was meaningful to what was removed in order to build this building.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good evening, Mr. Bomer. Appreciate you being before the board. It's been a long time since I've read a peer review that was as negative as this one. So help me out a little bit. Is there any redeeming quality from your point of view to the site as it is currently proposed?
I think I'd have to wind back to the project eligibility letter and think about how to interpret language that is trying to determine whether sites are suitable for this, for 40B development. And I think that, as I said, I think mass housing was correct. I think the site can be developed, but given what would be lost in the development of this site, and combined with, as I said at the beginning, I think a real lack of ability to to in any measurable or even perceivable way the goals of 40B design guidelines. And I don't think you even have to, I don't think everybody knows that 40Bs are going to be of a scale that are not going to match the context, but that doesn't mean that you can plant a large parking garage in a small scale neighborhood and then build a 4-story building on top of it. I think this is, I mean, to be completely blunt, this is very far outside of virtually all of the proposals I see for 40B developments, which is why I struggled. The most hopeful approach that I could take to analyzing this building was really trying to think of better options and hoping that that they'd be considered.
So am I given to understand from your answer that you would consider this design to be one of the worst ones you've seen in your experience reviewing 40B proposals?
I've seen some pretty bad ones, for sure. And Judy knows that. We've looked at some together, but this one it's really out there. Again, I think at any moment when I thought, and I did think long and hard about writing this report, but any time that I thought maybe I was being too harsh, I would look at that image again of this building. And I don't think I've ever, and this I think is totally true. I don't recall ever seeing a project that was such a disjuncture with context. Just again, to a degree where I couldn't think of anything to do to make this building work.
Is there something that is there a good feature of this building? Is there something that you think is praiseworthy that's in the current design, or just completely?
Well, it's a lot of affordable units. That's what's good about it. It really helps address a really serious problem. But I think the designs are fairly conventional. I don't see the connection with the choice of a mansard roof and 3 stories of clapboards. I don't really see the any kind of historic connection. But a lot of the review is also beyond my expertise. Is this the right parking ratio? I don't know, but the current proposal has a very large parking garage and 16 more spaces out in front of the building.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's it for now.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Further to thank you, Mr. Bowman, for being with us. We appreciate your time and professional advice. Following up on Mr. O'Brien's point, can you offer us some comparative advice with respect to how to make this site work? So, I'm looking for themes. So where does it start? You gave us the one idea of a potential building along the road. You mentioned the importance of the units. Certainly, the importance of affordable housing is something that is on the board's mind. But I'm interested in the scale. Is it off by a factor of 20, of 30?
No.
How much? Okay. So
no, that's a really fair question, and I didn't provide any sketches. That's not usually what I do, but I think that a responsible approach to developing this I think you can fit a double loaded building, so a building on the order of 60 to 65 feet wide with probably an L-shaped building. I think the long leg of the L would be relatively close to the road so that you would preserve the existing mansion and the garden. And then I would run, the other leg of the L would run east-west along the border with the school, because I think the issues of impact on the school are far less important than the issues to the neighbors on the traffic circle to the east. And I think you can fit a non-trivial footprint in that space, perhaps up to something like 40 units. And I think that in that scenario, I think you could still have the driveway, a slope driveway that could get you under the building, so you could still park under the building and not have to pave over the site to get open air parking. I think that's possible to do it that way. And again, I think in that scenario, then you would develop the historic home as housing as well.
Right.
And preserve the gardens for passive recreation for all of the residents. And in that scenario, I think you'd have enough space left over for stormwater management and for active recreation space as well.
You know, thank you. One of the things we had in the scope of work for your assignment was a working session. And I know there hasn't been one scheduled, but do you think there would be value in scheduling one?
I do. I think, if the developer is amenable to it, they are usually pretty productive. It helps to get more perspective on it for everybody.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time. I wonder, Ms. Barrett, do you have some advice to the board at this point, or do you want to defer to the other participants in the hearing?
Well, I would certainly, defer to the applicant too, but I think that a work session in this case is really, will be very important. I agree with Cliff on that. I think we need to kind of have a session with the applicant and their architect and maybe start to explore some options here that would perhaps be, conducive to what the developer is trying to achieve, and at the same time address the issues that Cliff has raised.
Thank you. Mr. Schomer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, board members. We've had here tonight D'Artagnan Brown from Embark Architecture. He's available, as well as Daniel Riggs to offer some brief response. For my part, I will say that work group sessions are something that are commonly done in Chapter 40B hearings. They're usually very productive, and we do them almost as a rule. It's an integral part of a collaborative process to respond to the concerns of the town and the town's peer reviewer. As we move forward through that process, what I would say, it would be helpful to get a little bit more in detail in terms of the specifics of what Mr. Bemler's concerns are in terms of the project impacts, and how in his view, they can be appropriately mitigated through the design elements as we have proposed them, as those will be going through changes as the plan moves forward. So I would say yes to a work group. That would be helpful, and we can certainly arrange that. Probably the time to do something like that would be after we've had an opportunity to review this report in greater detail, since we did get it today. So we've had a chance to preliminarily review it, but haven't been able to fully digest it and discuss it with the team. So perhaps that could be scheduled for some time in March, after we've had an opportunity to review and respond to some of the more specific considerations, because there are a number of very specific items that are mentioned in the report that we are in the process already of addressing, and will continue to do so.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, Ms. Barrett.
Yeah, I just wanted to also remind the board that Mrs. Lyons' review, the landscape architect, has been funded by the applicant. Thank you. And that contract's in play. I've been in communication with the landscape architect. I think that her review also should be kind of considered here. and her review is expected sometime around the middle of March. You just can't get it done before then.
Thank you. Mr. Schumer, I'll note that I know you said that you'd be willing to do a design review meeting or a working session, but you also said that I don't think you were willing to give up some of your initial design themes and considerations. So it feels to me a little bit like a non-answer, frankly. You heard the peer review. In order to participate in the working sessions and make it productive, somebody's going to have to give up some design theme.
Do you mind if I jump in, Mr. Chair?
Well, I'd like Mr. Schumer to respond to the comment. If you
Yeah,
could. I want to make sure I understood what he was saying, because I think what he said was he's not going to change the design intent.
that's not what I
Okay.
meant.
I think that's what you said, though.
I think what I meant to say, and perhaps it was inarticulate of me, we need an opportunity to review Mr. Bamler's report and then decide how to incorporate and to what extent to incorporate his recommendations into the plan. So we are absolutely willing to consider making project revisions in response to his concerns and his recommendations. And that would be absolutely on the table for this work group session.
Okay, thank you.
D'Artagnan?
Yes, Mr. Brown.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Cliff, good to see you, even given the report. And I think if I could just step back a second and just say we've had the pleasure to work with Cliff on numerous 40Bs. So I'm glad to see you, Cliff. And, I do appreciate getting the report. I think I'd like to just offer to the board that we are very open to working through a resolve that will get, be able to address as much as we can the comments, Cliff, that you've raised. I just hope from past experience, you've seen that we've been able to do that. I think on our end, Daniel and I have already started to kind of ruminate on a bunch of ideas around notions raised in the report, and we will be, looking forward to it, sitting down and running through some ideas with you. We're going to go back to the group as well and run through some of the, because I think even as you mentioned, before we even get into the clapboard detailing and stuff, we have to understand the site strategy. And there's a bunch that's been tossing around in our heads, and we just need a little bit, but a quick bit of time to be able to go back to our clients, go back to Jesse and his group, and come back with a responsive approach to developing a site plan strategy that we think will have some merit. And so with that, I think Jesse, we would be happy, and I defer to the group about maybe having some even preliminary conversations at the right time with Cliff, just to understand positioning of a direction based on some initial comments, both from Cliff, yourself, and we've had a couple, I think 3 different site walks with abutters in the neighborhood, and we're very, as you know, and I hope you know, as architects, our goal is to be able to respond while balancing the parameters of the 40B, which we've again done with you on several jobs. And so I think, I do feel that there is hope in being able to come up with this solution. And therefore, I would say, if it's okay with the group, but whatever the timing is, as soon as possible to be able to strategize around that would be, I think, beneficial to the overall process.
Terrific.
Thank you. Mr. Schumer, anything else?
Not for me, Mr. Chair.
Is Mr. Hill here? Can I ask-
Hello, I'm here for Dan tonight.
Ms. Baptista, hi. Welcome back to the board.
Thank you.
Is there anything that you'd like to offer on behalf of the Vos Hill Neighborhood Association?
I don't have anything specific to add. I don't think it comes as a shock that we echo a lot of Cliff's comments tonight. We also are very interested in seeing a new set of designs that are able to preserve the gardens and the mansion. And to the extent that it is acceptable, we would be interested in having a seat at the table for these working sessions.
Yeah, I think that would be appropriate. The question on the table with respect to the working session, and I think Mr. Schomer said he's going to think about the scheduling of it, is whether to have the working session before seeing some revised concepts or after. I don't know that there's a good answer for that tonight, but I'd like the parties to think about that, and perhaps we could talk about that either at the end of tonight or when we're rescheduling or at the next scheduled meeting. But I appreciate your point, Ms. Baptista, and I would encourage the community to participate in a working session.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Can I ask if there's any, I'm sorry.
If I may, Mr. Chair, just a
Mr. Schomer.
suggestion in terms of sequence and timing. Typically, it's helpful to have some idea of a direction that the project is going before sitting down at the table to have the working session, because if we come back with a design that is significantly revised from our perspective but does not meet the Cliff's recommendations, it's tough to have a conversation about clapboards at that point and shingles. So I would say that the sequence should be after we've had an opportunity to come back and present our revised plan to the board.
Yeah, and we should clarify. I mean, Mr. Boma's recommendations were more conceptual, and they were a review of the proposal that he received. He wasn't redesigning your project. We asked him, perhaps unfairly, for some design concepts. So that shouldn't be taken as a redesign. I don't think it was, but fair enough. We'll try to schedule a working session after the time that you come back to the board with some reaction to the peer review and citizen input that you've received. Is that fair?
It's fair.
Okay, terrific. Is there anybody in the audience who'd like to be heard? A question for the peer reviewer?
There is. Hello,
Mr.
Mr.
Lavash.
Lavash.
Yeah, hello. Cliff, thank you for your testimony tonight.
Mr. Lavash, could you, I know we know who you are, but.
Yeah, so I'm a neighbor. I live at 585 Brush Hill Road. I'm a licensed architect, and I'm a partner at Wilson Butler Architects. So Cliff, I appreciate, we've never worked before in the past, but I echo everything that you have said in your report here. This is the reason why I have been on in representing my neighbors, is I just think that this project is particularly insensitive to the historic house and gardens that are on the property. And I want to echo your statement with, I do think that this is a site to have 40B housing here. And I think it is an opportunity to, to look at adaptive reuse, exactly as you said. I think there is a winning strategy here, both for the neighbors and the town of Milton. But I think it needs to do, there needs to be a compromise of both. And I will echo your density piece to this. It completely, I know another part of your report was specifically speaking about this is completely auto dependent. And I'm a neighbor. I lived in this neighborhood for over a year now. And I'll tell you, absolutely, there's no parks really around here. And so to save the gardens and make it really a public place, I think would be a really positive thing for the neighborhood. And I think there's a project here, but you absolutely need to come back to the table and look at it. And so I will echo as well is, listen, I would love to sit down with Dartigan and yourself, and look at some options here. And I think, there's a project here to preserve what's really great about the site. But I also think that there's some projects here to get some affordable housing, which this town really needs. So I just want to echo that statement. I think we've reached out to you, our lawyers reached out to you. And so, let's sit down and have a working session, and we would love to be a part of that.
Thank you, Mr. Lavash. Anybody else from the neighborhood?
I don't see anyone. No, no one else has their hands up.
Thank you. Mr. Bowman, thank you very much for your time and your expertise, and we look
Oh,
forward.
wait a minute. I'm sorry, Laura Kessler. I'm sorry. Laura Kessler just put her hand up.
Ms. Kessler?
Good evening. I'm at 87 Robin Street, and I spoke to the select board about this project first at the March 11th meeting of 2020. And at that time, the first thing when we saw the application come through, the quote from Embark was that the use of traditional design elements with high quality building materials and informed detailing will create a harmonious, appropriately scaled, and nuanced facade design in keeping with the surrounding architectural fabric. I commented that the surrounding neighborhood houses are not multi-family monstrosities. I hold to that feeling now. I can't believe when I looked at the report talking about the actual size of structure. I'm a layperson, so I wasn't really able to visualize the size of this. I went on the site walk. I asked about the shadow study or whatever happens to make sure that the people on Meeting House can see the sun at some point. And when I look at the size of this and I think this building, it's just the structure and the lot, the parking. Am I correct? It will be 1.5 acres in size. I'm at 87, so I have 1.04 acres. It's 150 feet across the front and 300 down. So if this structure on page 3, it says it's 330 feet long. That would take you 30 feet into the backyards on Craig Street behind me on Robin Street. And then if you look at the width of it, 230 feet long. So I'm 150 feet across the front. My neighbors next door have a 75-foot frontage, 1/2 acre. So are you saying that this is as big as 87 Robin Street land and 79 Robin Street land, just the structure and the garage? Because I wasn't able to appreciate the size of it when I walked around on the open space, even excluding if you obliterate the garden, which is a horrible shame. But as I walked through the whole of it, I couldn't even encompass that it is that big. Is that the size of this? Am I right?
Mr. Brown?
That is correct. But again, Laura, as I mentioned, we're contemplating adjusting site approach, and we've loudly heard comments from you and others, and we're going to look forward to a working session with Cliff and move forward. We certainly hear you, Laura, and I think again.
Then why do you file applications like this? You wouldn't have to go through all this.
I think that's why we're going to
filed something that was reasonable in the beginning.
Let me remind people to address the comments to the chair. So Ms. Kessler, you can ask me a question and I'll relay that to the applicant.
I don't have a question.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Anybody else has a comment or for tonight's hearing with respect to the design review?
Nope, not anymore right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. I see that Mr. Dirk is with us from Vanessa and Associates, who is our traffic and safety peer review consultant. Mr. Dirk, it's good to see you. Welcome back to the Board of Appeals.
Nice to see you as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nice to see you as well. Good evening, members of the board. Just by way of introduction, my name is, as your chair has mentioned, Jeffrey Dirk, managing partner with Vanessa and Associates, and we're your traffic and safety review consultant on this project. So my review is going to have probably a much different tone, I think, than the last discussion that you had. Although with the same level of seriousness, obviously, with regards to our review. As I mentioned, our review really is focused on assessing the traffic impacts of the project as presented by the applicant. And primarily, given that this is a comprehensive permit project, like Cliff was focusing on architecture and scale of the building, what we're looking at is the scale of the project more as it relates to its impacts on the transportation infrastructure and specifically on safety. So the safety of all users of the roadway network. So that's what our peer review is really looking at with regard to this project itself. So the documents that we reviewed as a part of our assessment were essentially the June 2020 traffic study that was prepared for the project by MDM Transportation Consultants, as well as the site plans. And as we're looking at the site plans, it's really with regard to the ability to access the site in a safe manner. And then within the site, looking at circulation within the property and looking at access for both emergency vehicles and service vehicles. So in this case, we'd be looking at moving vans as well as trash and recycling vehicles to make sure that as the site's designed, it can function in a safe manner as you proceed into the site. We also looked at the parking supply and assessed that with regards to adequacy as well. So with regard to the traffic study that was prepared for the project, the first thing we need to do is determine that it was prepared in accordance with industry standards. Those standards in this case are set by the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. So they have a series of guidelines that we as transportation professionals need to follow in conducting transportation analyses. And really the intent of that is so that as you're looking at multiple applications that you have before you for projects, all of those studies should be conducted in the same manner. And so if they're done in the same manner, then that allows you to look at cumulative impacts of projects. And that's probably the most important thing, is to be able to understand how these multiple development proposals impact the infrastructure within the town itself. So in looking at that kind of baseline analysis, the study was done in accordance with all accepted standards, both the Department of Transportation as well as industry standards. So we've confirmed that that in fact took place. The study area that the project assessed was, as we saw, was adequate in terms of the area. However, what you'll see is a constant theme in our comments is that what was striking in looking at the study area was that as we looked at the distribution of traffic, and the project's going to produce at 118 units, approximately 50 peak hour trips. So if you looked at the highest traffic volume hour in the morning between 7 and 9, the highest traffic volume hour in the evening between 4 and 6, this project will produce about 50 new vehicle trips on the roadway network. Now, the applicant's estimate in looking at US Census data is about 60% of those trips will travel to the north on Blue Hill Avenue, 40% to the south. So you can see those 50 trips as you get further away from the site, the numbers get smaller and smaller. But what was striking in looking at that distribution of traffic is that the 60% of traffic that travels to the north, they had indicated about 5% of it leaves Blue Hill Avenue somewhere between the project site and the northernmost intersection at Brook Road. And so what that said to us is there's obviously an intervening street, a side street, a residential street that is going to have traffic, but wasn't included as a part of the traffic study. And as we looked at that, that's really Robin Street. And so that's the next signalized intersection to the north. So that was one of the things that really, as you look at the study, that's something that jumps out at you. And so we've asked the applicant to supplement their traffic study with looking at really the first major intersection to the north of the site at Robin Street. So we've asked for them to do a little bit more additional analysis of how the project might impact that intersection, looking at safety at that location as well, similar to what they had done at their other study intersections. So that's one of the things that we've asked the applicant to go back and take a look at. Now, focusing on safety, because it's probably one of the more important things, we're looking at how the project impacts motorist delays and vehicle queuing on the roadway. So, if you're driving by the site and you have no interest in what's taking place in this property and you're just on the roadway, you really want to know, if I'm at a backup at a traffic signal and there's 5 cars in front of me, what's going to happen after this project is there? Is it going to double the number of cars that are waiting? And how long is it going to take for me to travel along Blue Hill Avenue? So in looking at that level of analysis, what the analysis showed was those 50 vehicle trips as you get away from the site and they distribute themselves onto the roadway, You didn't really see any significant impacts in terms of added delay or motor or vehicle queuing at intersections. And so what I mean by that is that the number of vehicles backed up in an intersection didn't increase by more than 2 vehicles in general. And that if you are experiencing delays at an intersection, the difference before and after the project would be less than 10 seconds of increased delay. So it wasn't significant. So in looking at safety, the applicant undertook an evaluation of motor vehicle crashes within the study area at each of the intersections that they evaluated. And when they undertake that analysis, what they look at is the number of crashes that are happening in relation to the volume of traffic that's passing through the intersection. And they compare that number of crashes to a state average or statewide average, both locally for the Milton area, as well as just the entire Commonwealth, to see if the number of crashes that are happening is disproportionate to the volume of traffic going through the intersection. So in the case of the analysis that the applicant undertook, what they showed was that there are no high crash locations as defined by Mass DOT within the study area. And that was confirmed by some data also by the Milton Police Department, that there was no sections of this roadway that had experienced a disproportionate number of motor vehicle crashes that wouldn't be expected based on the volume of traffic on the roadway. The other safety analysis that's undertaken is with regards to lines of sight at the access points into the property. So what's important in assessing the driveway locations is to make sure that if you're traveling along Blue Hill Avenue and you're driving by the driveways at the project site, if the vehicle pulls out of the site, you need to be able to see that vehicle in sufficient time to be able to apply your brakes and stop so that you're not having a collision with the driveway. And then the second distance or the second criteria that's assessed is that if you're exiting the property, and this site has 2 driveways at the approximate location of the existing driveways, with the northernmost driveway will function as a full access driveway, so both entering and exiting. And the southernmost access will just be an exit only. So if you're coming out of either of those driveways and looking to the left or right along Blue Hill Avenue, you need to be able to see a vehicle and make a decision as to whether it's safe to be able to pull out of the property without experiencing a collision with a vehicle on Blue Hill Avenue. So they're looking at both of those conditions. So they did measure travel speeds along Blue Hill Avenue. It has a posted speed limit of 35 miles an hour. They measured a prevailing travel speed. And these measurements were taken pre-COVID. And I think that's another important thing to mention is all of the data collection was done in October of 2019. So it's basically, prior to COVID really impacting traffic volumes. So those speed measurements that they had undertaken recorded prevailing travel speed, and that's defined as the speed at which 85% of the vehicles that they measured either traveled at or below. That was found to be about 43 miles an hour, so pretty close to 45 miles an hour. So they assessed those sight lines, the driveway, based on both the posted speed limit at 35 miles an hour. And I think more importantly is what we want to see is that these sight lines are adequate for the measured speed. So not the posted speed, but the speed that people are actually driving, which is closer to the 45 miles an hour. So at 45 miles an hour, you need to be able to have a sight line either approaching the driveway or exiting the property of about 360 feet. The applicant measured at the driveways a sight line that exceeded 400 feet, both approaching as well as exiting the property. So the sight lines there, the vegetation is set sufficiently back from the edge of the traveled way. But the other thing that at least is present today along Blue Hill Avenue is you have very or extremely wide shoulders along that roadway. So those provide some benefits from the standpoint of sight lines, because as the vehicle's exiting the property, they actually don't enter the traveled way for almost 5 to 6 feet, basically, because of the wide shoulders that are there. So there's a significant buffer between the curb line on Blue Hill Avenue and the actual edge of the traveled way. So that does provide some advantages from the standpoint of sight lines. I do mention that only in that we know that in the future, and hopefully as funding comes through, that the Blue Hill Avenue will be reconstructed to reduce its width, and reduce its width by means of striping some bike lanes out there, providing sidewalks along both sides and a shared use path, which will all be beneficial. But the sight lines are independent of the wide shoulders that are out there. And I mention that only because this project, to the extent that it moves forward, will be in place for some time, and it will be there when the Mass DOT road improvement project comes through. So the sight lines not only need to be adequate for today, but they need to be adequate for when Mass DOT comes in and reduces essentially the shoulders and turns those into bike lanes or a shared use path. And what we've confirmed is that the sightlines would meet the criteria with or without the Mass DOT project. So that's important as well. So with regards to the transportation assessment, those are our overall findings. So it's really, as you look at it, there were no safety concerns raised with respect to motor vehicle crashes or the sight lines of the driveway. With regards to the roadway transportation infrastructure and sufficiency to accommodate the project, the analysis that they provided demonstrated that there is sufficient capacity. We'll reserve that comment though, however, until we see the analysis at Robin Street, just to confirm those findings as well, but we don't expect that that's going to significantly change. We did provide some recommendations that the applicant and the board should consider to the extent that they approve the project, and those recommendations really they focus on looking at implementation of a transportation demand management program. So there's been a lot of discussion tonight about this being an auto-centric project. And I don't disagree with that with respect to the ability to be able to get to an area amenities, that it's primarily, there's no sidewalk where this project site is located at the present time. It's actually opposite, on the opposite side of Blue Hill Avenue and to the north of the project site. So suggesting that people will walk is probably not realistic because those accommodations don't exist today. There is the ability to bicycle, and we do note that the applicant has included bicycle accommodations as a part of the site plan. Within the parking garage, there's a bike area, but we've asked that they provide bicycle racks exterior to the building as well, and that's pretty common because that's where your visitors are going to park. Those wide shoulders are obviously have advantages to be able to accommodate bicycle travel, so we certainly would like to encourage that. The other thing is there is bus service going by the project site. So a transportation demand management program will provide at least the residents with the options to use alternative modes of transportation. And I think most importantly is to make sure they're aware of what services are available. And then to the extent that they decide to use those services, that the site itself has amenities to be able to accommodate those. So you heard discussion of at least a sidewalk that gets you out to Blue Hill Avenue. So if you do want to wait to take the bus, you're able to do that. And then of course, those bicycle accommodations I had mentioned. So that's a suggestion with regards to potential recommendations in the transportation study. So the second thing that we looked at was the site plan itself. So we do have specific comments with regards to access and circulation. Those comments deal with, as I mentioned, the bike rack to be provided within the project site. We asked that the applicant reconcile the architectural plan and the site plan with regards to the parking garage. So if you look at the site plans and you look at the architectural plan, there is some inconsistency as to where the garage door is located. We make that as a comment because reconciling that could have some impacts on the overall parking supply. So it's important that that kind of marries up together so that we know what is the real number of parking spaces that we're dealing with in the project site. The applicant has proposed a parking ratio of 1.5. It's actually just below, it's like 1.49 or something like that, but pretty close to 1.5. We have provided some information to the board as a part of our review to suggest that the actual parking demands for similar communities might be a little bit higher than that, not significantly higher, but we've asked that they increase the parking supply to something closer to 1.52 or 1.55. Which would essentially add another 3 parking spaces to the site to the extent that they retain the number of units. But again, that's why it's critical we understand the parking garage and make sure that the architectural plan and the site plan marry up, because we need to know, are we talking about adding 3 spaces or are we talking about adding 6 spaces to try to get to a parking supply that's adequate for the project site? So that does need to be addressed. The other thing in terms of looking at the circulation within the property. So as I mentioned, they have a 2-way access drive at the north end of the site. Once you enter upon the project site, there is a parking area at the front of the building. And then it's a 24-foot wide drive aisle that extends from Blue Hill Avenue to the entrance to the parking garage. And then after that, it transitions to a 20-foot one-way clockwise roadway that then proceeds around the building, again, clockwise direction, exits out to Blue Hill Avenue as a one-way exit only driveway. So it's very important, given that directional flow and the change from 2-way to 1-way, that they have appropriate signs and pavement markings. So those need to be provided both at Blue Hill Avenue as well as within the site so that motorists know what the proper direction of travel. And then looking at the parking area at the front of the building, The applicant did provide a turning analysis for both the Milton Fire Department design vehicle as well as a trash recycling vehicle and a moving van. So the fire apparatus, they did drive around the building to show that that works. What will be important as well is to make sure that the fire apparatus can get to the front of the building. So that needs to be able to get to that front parking area, especially for an ambulance. If there's emergency and they need to transport someone out of the building, they're going to do that through the front entrance. And so that will be in that front parking area. So showing the analysis of how that will operate, in particular, the backing maneuvers, because the fire apparatus, once it gets to the front of that building, even an ambulance, they'll need to demonstrate how does it maneuver. It doesn't need to back all the way up along the front of the building, then get into that 24-foot wide drive aisle, make a 3-point turn, and then exit onto Blue Hill Avenue. So those are the things that we need to see. And I would think your fire department's going to want to see that so that they can render a decision to you as to whether there's adequate circulation for them to be able to get to the building for both emergencies relating to firefighting as well as emergency medical services. And those would all occur to the front of the building. So we've asked the applicant to undertake the turning analysis to show that that's feasible. The other thing in looking at the full access driveway, so again, the 24-foot wide access driveway, and there was some discussion tonight about the grades within the site. So as I was discussing the sight lines for vehicles exiting the property, what's important, especially as we look at the weather conditions that we had today, is a perfect example. You want to really have a 2% leveling area as you come out to Blue Hill Avenue. Again, given the conditions like you had today, it's important that you've got a leveling area so that vehicles either entering or exiting the property can come up to Blue Hill Avenue and have a maneuvering area, essentially relatively level, so they can stop their vehicles. And so that's important for safety, but it's also important for the sight lines. If the grades of the driveway exceed 2%, that affects the sight lines because the driver is not at a level position as they're trying to exit the property. So we really want that 2%, or 2% is ideal, so that we've got that coming out of the property, coming up to Blue Hill Avenue. I typically suggest that that distance be 50 feet, but it should at least be 25 feet. 50 feet is essentially 2 car lengths. 25 feet is 1 car length. So at least if you've got 1 car length, the vehicle that's sitting at the stop line at Blue Hill Avenue is at a level position. 2 car lengths allows for 1 vehicle to be there and then a vehicle to come up behind them. And again, try to have them be relatively level. So if you've got icing conditions, it's something it's comfortable for a motorist to be able to stop their motor vehicle. So we've asked the applicant to take a look at the grades of the driveway as well. Also minor comments just with respect to some notes and showing the site triangles on the site plan, all of which the applicant should be able to incorporate into the site plans. So that concludes my review and a presentation of our overall findings, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Dirk. Appreciate your time and expertise. I wonder if the members of the board have any questions for Mr. Dirk. Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought that we had solved the issue, or at least seen some light on the issue of the ability of emergency apparatus to access the site, given the testimony that we had some days ago regarding from the fire chief, as well as the turning analysis that was provided by the applicant. But I have to admit that I'm very confused as to whether there is sufficient access or not. And I'm not an engineer, so somebody's going to have to give somebody a straight answer about whether or not there's sufficient access for fire apparatus, etc. Because I thought I had heard it. Now I'm not so sure. And I'm not suggesting that anybody I need a bottom line answer here. So I put that out to the group. So that's one of the concerns that I have. The other question that I have for the applicant, I'm sorry, for the engineer, and thank you, Mr. Dirk, very, actually kind of a fascinating presentation. The leveling area, that's not you were talking about a leveling area where you come up, there has to be a spot where essentially the vehicle could slow down or stop before, I guess, you slide onto the roadway would be the worst case scenario, okay? And having had that happen to me in other situations, is there sufficient space now there existing to put that in place?
So the applicant, I mean, similar to what they're undergoing with respect to the site design. So it all, Cliff was right in that a lot of this is interrelated. So the answer is there is sufficient room to be able to do that. However, it does affect the rest of the site plan. And so that's where the applicant's going to need to take a look at. It relates to the placement of the building, the locations of the parking areas. So the answer is there is sufficient distance to be able to do that. However, the applicant will need to rework their site plan to try to accomplish that. So that's why we've kind of, from the standpoint of the applicant, both looking at it as well as the board. So we've given you kind of a minimum dimension and an ideal dimension. So the minimum dimension would be 25 feet. And ideally, it's no more than 2%. Ideally, it's 50 feet for no more than 2%. Now, if the applicant comes back and says, listen, the best we're going to be able to do to hold the building and get down to grade at the parking garage, because the foundation obviously has to be level. And so as soon as they set the building and then set the foundation and set the foundation level within the site, that controls a lot of the grades because that's fixed and Blue Hill Avenue is fixed. And so once you fix those points, there's only so much you're going to be able to do with the grades within the site. So the applicant then would need to come back and say, the best we can do is 3% for 25 feet, and then we can evaluate that. And is that a deal breaker? Absolutely not. But I think what we want to try to do is similar to what your other review consultants are doing, which is to say, these are the ideal design parameters. So go back and see if you can meet these. If you can't meet these, then tell us what the best is that you can do and how you will mitigate the fact that you're not able to achieve these ideal parameters. So it's completely acceptable to have grades of less than 2% or more than 2%. But what we need to figure out is, can they achieve it? So we need to push them to try to achieve kind of the best solution. If they can't achieve the best solution, then what are the design alternatives? And that's something that we can evaluate. But the first thing is, to really push them to try to see if they can achieve the ideal parameter.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, if I may, I was just expressing a little frustration about some of the confusion regarding the turning apparatus.
Yes.
And as Mr. Schomer has reminded us in the past, it is an iterative process. And as this project goes on, obviously will change, and some of those other things would change as well. With that, I have nothing further at this time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Ms. Jaffer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Dirk, for your presentation. I have two questions. The first, and I've asked this a couple of times in the past to others, relates to the potential impact, or maybe not, of rideshare vehicles and delivery vehicles to the site. How do you take that into consideration?
So the traffic estimates for the project actually include all of those vehicles. And one of the nice things that we have now is that the database that the traffic numbers are based on, so the trip generation database, is relatively recent. So these new phenomena that have occurred with the rideshare vehicles and the vehicles for hire and others, FedEx, UPS, and now those constant Amazon deliveries are built into the traffic numbers. So essentially they account for all those types of vehicles. I think the important consideration, however, is that the site plan needs to account for the fact that you've got these pickup and drop off operations taking place. So really, as we look at that parking supply, that's why if you design to the absolute bare minimum, you're not really providing for those users to have a space, at the front of the building. And maybe it's something that the applicant could look at designating some spaces, just one, maybe two at the front of the building there for this type of short-term pickup and drop-off activities, because we know that's going to occur. And so it's really a matter of accommodating them. And if you design for a parking minimum, you're going to end up with a problem, and they're going to double park. And that gets back to, really from the fire department access, that's an absolute no-no, especially at the front of the building. That has to be unobstructed at all times for medical emergencies. And so it's really something designed for it because it's a reality, but it is built into the traffic numbers.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. My second question relates to the school next door. So I think it was one of the community members, neighbors who mentioned, it gets really busy during drop off and pickup, and sort of maybe the entry to the school is very close to the exit entry for the proposed development. Are there any concerns about that? Like just a lot of cars trying to exit onto Blue Hill at the same time?
So really the key thing for driveways like that is to make sure you need proper sight lines between the two driveways, because what ends up happening is as long as the motorists have clear line of sight to each other, that they could avoid a collision. So that's really the key thing. If there's congestion and that, let's say the pickup and drop offs end up with queuing along Blue Hill Avenue, so they block the access to the project site. That's going to be an operational issue within the site. However, the benefit from the standpoint of circulation, at least with respect to this property, is that there is the ability to exit out the other driveway. So to the extent that you live there and you know that there's backups that block the northernmost access, then you could exit the property and travel around the building and exit at the southernmost access. So it does afford those opportunities for residents. But I think the key thing for safety is that you need those proper sight lines.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair?
Thank you. I've got questions, but anticipating that this project is going to go through some redesigns, let me just say a couple of things that are on my mind. Mr. Dirk, did you take a look at the adequacy of a school bus of stopping up out on 138 and whether or not that could be done safely?
So the section that we're on, so there's a couple of things with regards to that. So there's that wide shoulder. So there's certainly ability, you could stop the bus out on the shoulder. I kind of go back and forth on that. So the issue with stopping on the shoulder is that inevitably, unfortunately, what happens is the motorists that are behind the bus see that as that the bus is pulled over. And even though it's red flashing lights are on, there's still that potential for people to pass the bus. So although they certainly could stop on the shoulder area and not impede the flow of traffic along Blue Avenue, I wouldn't advocate for that to be the case, because I really want the bus to stop in the travel lane, put on the flashing lights, and stop the traffic, because that's state law and that's really what needs to happen for safety. So there is enough room to do that, but I would want the bus to stop the traffic on Blue Hill Avenue. I would even encourage the bus to, block some of the shoulder. People are unfortunately so impatient that they do pass the bus, and I don't want them passing. I want them passing at all, but I certainly don't want them passing on the right.
Thank you. Given the volume of potential people who might use this bus stop, given its lack of walking distance to most of Milton's schools, what would you say about an introduction of a sidewalk for the area of the frontage?
I think that would be a great idea, at least along the frontage of the property.
Yeah.
I think it at least gives that ability to have the safe area to be able to wait for a bus. So I think that's a great idea.
So a couple of things, I don't know that you need to respond to them, but I know that the design team is doing some survey on Blue Hill Avenue to confirm the site distance to the south. That was a question given the shelf. There's also some testimony at an earlier hearing from David Black, whom I know you're familiar with, who was representing the community and expressed concerns about the entry and exit points and the design of those, particularly in relation to the Vose Hill Road exit or the across 138 and the school. So one of the things, and you're going to be reviewing some of the modifications to the design. So one of the things I would like you to be looking for is whether or not the redesign has addressed safety concerns at the entry and exit points, as well as how those entry and exit points interrelate with site circulation, since there's been questions in this testimony as to whether or not the applicant is going to continue to adhere to the two-way entry road on the north side and the one-way exit road on the south side. That's in question. So we don't have to evaluate it now, but it is something that I would expect that we'll look at again, partly because there's been some suggestion of making the parking area in front or through parking areas so that you'd enter from the north, go through the site, and then exit at the south, which you can't do now because you have to turn around. So that's a little bit of a forecast of what I would expect to be seeing in some redesign, addressing some of the testimony that we've had before you joined us. So, and those are things that are on mind. I don't have any other questions for you, Mr. Dirk, unless you have something you'd like to say.
I don't think so, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the forewarning of those other items to come.
Ms. Barry, is there anything you'd like to add at this point?
No, I'm fine. My questions have been answered by the various questions that board members had.
Thank
And
you.
I've also had the opportunity to speak with Jeff on the side. So no, I don't have any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Schumer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Dirk, for the very thorough presentation. I had just one question, and then I'll pass it off to Bob Michaud, and perhaps he can respond more specifically to the points that you made in your report, Mr. Dirk. The question that I had for you, it goes to an issue that's not within the four corners of your report. So if you don't feel prepared to offer your thoughts on it tonight, I would understand it, and maybe you'd like to think about this. But at some previous meetings, there was some public testimony and commentary calling into question the reliability of ITE data as it relates to property development in the state of Massachusetts. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, and as it relates to your work in designing traffic studies for development, and whether you ever have to go back and reconsider projects that you had previously made traffic projections for, and specifically whether you've ever encountered instances where ITE data has significantly underestimated traffic flow.
So what I would say is that if the transportation analysis is done properly, I have not had an instance where we have underrepresented the amount of traffic that a project would generate. A significant number of my projects involve conditions where we are required to go back and monitor traffic on an annual basis and compare the actual measured traffic volumes to our predictions. And the ITE data, when you apply the methodology properly, the numbers generally overestimate the volume of traffic that it will be produced. And that's done on purpose. It's done on purpose to make sure that the transportation infrastructure and any improvements that are proposed are adequately designed with some freeboard. So essentially additional capacity to make sure that if there are fluctuations, because fluctuations happen daily and seasonally, that the design is proper to account for those fluctuations, because traffic volumes change over the course of the week and over the months of the year. And so there's some residual capacity built into the ITE number. So I typically find if you do your estimates properly, which was done in this case, that the numbers will be appropriate for the development.
Thank you very much. That's it. I appreciate your thoughts on that, Mr. Dirk, especially since I put you on the spot to a certain extent. So thank you very much. Mr. Chair, if I may pass it off to Bob Michaud.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, board members. Hello, Jeff. As is always the case, Vanessa's review, Jeff's review is done very professionally, and we appreciate that. We're pleased with the outcome of the review. Certainly, I think there's some general concurrence as to methodology and findings. And as is the case with any peer review, there's always something to refine or improve, and that is the case here as well. We will be evaluating the Robbins intersection. We'll be conducting new counts for that location. I, in prior testimony, indicated that the Central Transportation Planning staff had incorporated that very location into the Route 138 corridor study based on relatively current data, pre-COVID data, 2018, I believe. So we're going to be looking back to that pre-COVID data as a reference point as part of our response to Vanessa's review, as well as any of the crash data that go along with it. So we're pleased to be able to do that. We understand very clearly the need to articulate the emergency vehicle access and circulation, and we as a team have already been discussing options to perhaps improve the circulation aspect to the front of the building. So those are all points well taken and will be addressed in an upcoming formal response to the review. But we're pleased with the review, and we think that the remaining issues will be properly documented and accounted for in the upcoming filing. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything else from the applicant? Mr. O'Brien, a question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I apologize for this. So in thinking about the comments from both Mr. Dirk and Mr. Mashu, a question came into my mind. I believe that the reviewer and the applicant's traffic study noted that, I forget the terminology that was used, but I'll use my own. The mean speed on Blue Hill Avenue was somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 miles per hour. Is that correct? 43, 44?
Correct. The 85th percentile speed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. The 85th percentile speed. Was that also measured in the same October 2019 timeframe when pre-COVID? You're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, that was collected at the same time. Correct.
I'm wondering if there's any updated data concerning speeds on that highway at the moment, because I have, in my real world capacity, I've seen some data that would indicate that while traffic congestion is down, or overall traffic is down fairly significantly across the Commonwealth, we've seen an increase in highway speeds and consequently an increase in severity of accidents. I'm wondering if there's any new data regarding speed on Blue Hill Avenue that's readily available that may be of usefulness to this analysis. And if I'm all wet, please tell me.
No, it's a valid question. What we've seen is that on typically congested roadways, particularly highways, Route 128, 495, that there has been a substantial enough reduction in traffic volume that speeds have actually gone up because there's less congestion. And you are correct in pointing out that in certain instances, particularly on roads that are typically congested during peak hours, that because you are dealing with higher speeds in today's condition, that crashes, if they do occur, tend to be a little more serious, a little more than property damage. In the case of Blue Hill Avenue, the volumes that existed pre-COVID, which range between 400 and 600 directional vehicles during peak hours, did not result in the same type of congestion that you would see on those higher volume highway systems. So my educated estimate is that speed profiles on Blue Hill Avenue have not changed substantially from October of 2019 to current. Those speed profiles were taken during, an entire 48-hour period, actually, and would have represented, uncongested conditions, as is the case today with COVID and the reduction in volumes that have resulted. So I don't believe that the speed profiles have really changed materially from where they were a year ago, but we're certainly updating some information, including counts at Robin's And we would be glad to do a spot speed count to augment the data to satisfy your request. We could certainly do that and submit that as part of our upcoming filing.
Thank you. And as a related question, assume for the sake of argument, and I know that you're saying the speed profile hasn't changed substantially or of note. Assuming for the sake of argument that it does, would that impact the sightline calculation and whether the sightlines would be sufficiently safe as presently put in place?
Yes, it would affect the sightline calculation. So to the extent we measured speeds, the 85th percentile travel speeds at something greater than 45 miles an hour, that would require a longer sightline for either stopping sight distance or intersection sight distance. But I know that the measurements that we've already made exceed the requirements for even the 45 mile an hour travel speed. So there is some cushion in there, if you will, to account for the possibility that vehicle speeds might be even slightly higher than 45. But when we get the updated information, which we'll publish, we'll make that determination and report that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for accommodating my question.
You're welcome. Anything else, Mr. Schumer?
Not for me, sir.
Ms. Baptista?
Thank you. Mr. Chair, you did reference some prior testimony from Mr. Black, and I did want to let you know that I believe he is in attendance tonight and he may have some supplemental comments, but I did have just two quick things. One is one thing that Mr. Dirk did mention, and I know we've raised a couple of times as well, is that although these are preliminary plans, they have been a little too preliminary, especially with concern to the parking garage, and that has impeded our ability to really evaluate how many parking spots are available. Things such as any mechanical rooms, the trash room, access to a stormwater system if it is still going to be located under the building. We would like to ask that this next set of plans does show all of those aspects of the project. Another thing is, it was my understanding that the applicant had agreed to prepare a survey to address the issues, some of the questions, I should say, with regards to site distances south of the site because of some grade issues on Blue Hill Ave. And I just wanted to confirm that that was still the applicant's intent. Okay, I see nodding, so that looks good. So if the board would like to hear, we do have Mr. Black in the audience.
Mr. Black.
I think he's here.
Mr. Black, you've been recognized.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I will be brief, but I would just like to follow up on a couple of things and a reminder of what I talked about the last time I was with you on January 25th. I think it's very helpful to have Mr. Dirk's report, and I think there's a lot of helpful information in that. And I think we are, I think, all on the same page in terms of methodology here. The point I would like to just reiterate tonight is, and I think Mr. Dirk and Mr. Michaud are on the same page as this, safety is a major consideration, and the safety of the access, I think, is the one thing that I've had looked at fairly carefully and had some concerns about. And I think that I want to stress that whether the redesign of the project implied in that discussion is the fact that there may be some reduction in density. And I would just like to say that I don't think any reduction in density in any way diminishes the importance of the safety. The access needs to be safe for however many vehicles are using it. So I would urge the board to keep that in mind moving forward if there is any change in the density of the project. The concern I had about sightlines was really based on my observations in the field. They were not accurately measured in the same way that Mr. Michaud has done. And I think it was the southern driveway which gave me most concern because of the roadway profiles. So we're very pleased that there will be a survey done that will be able to accurately calculate that. But I think the possibly part of the difference of opinion on sightlines may be to do about where it's measured from. And Mr. Dirk did say that there's a wide shoulder, and that is very helpful for sightlines at the driveways. But I think we really need to think about where the stop line is going to be for the driveway, and whether that would actually be at the edge of the travel lane or at the edge of the shoulder. And I think that particularly if there's an introduction of a sidewalk along Blue Hill Avenue, I think the stop line is going to be somewhat further back. So again, I think we just need to look at the results of the survey and bear in mind what the roadway might look like after the improvements and where the stop line might be, because it's important to understand where the sightline requirements are really based on the position of the driver in relation to a stop line, and this will be a stop control by definition. So that really is just an addendum to what I said the last time. Mr. Dirk did have some response to comments on a bus stopping in the shoulder, and preferably stopping in the travel lane. But as we know, if buses are running, school buses are not on schedule, they do sometimes pull over to kill time. So there is a possibility that a bus would be in the shoulder, and that would certainly have an impact to the sight lines if we were relying on the shoulders to be part of those sight triangles. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Black. Ms. Baptiste, anything else you'd like to share with the board?
No, that was all I had.
Okay, so can I ask, thank you. Can I ask if there's anybody in the audience who has a question for anybody who's appeared before the board this evening?
Jamie Mulligan?
Good morning, good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the board. This is Pat Mulligan. My wife's Jamie. We've been listening along and have been involved in the hearings from the very beginning. And I would just like to thank you for letting me speak tonight. And I would also, before I say what I'm going to say, I would like to point out that I've spoken to Mr. Schomer and Joe Tamposi at the site walk, and found them to be people of goodwill. I want to say that I have nothing but respect for Mr. Dirk and Mr. Michaud in their area of expertise. However, those of us on Robin Street and the areas around that are really concerned with the fact that this application and the study that the application relies on totally ignores Robin Street and that intersection. It tells us all about the intersection at Brook Road, which is a mile down the road. It goes on and on about the intersection at Atherton, and for some reason just totally ignores the elephant in the room, which is the intersection at Robbins and Blue Hill Avenue. Now, again, you don't like to cast aspersions, but there's really only one reason why you would do that, and that's to basically draw people's attention away from that intersection. I'd also like to say that we're not concerned with traffic delay here. Traffic delay means nothing to those of us on Robin Street and in the areas around that. What we're concerned with is safety. And there are a lot of little kids running around on Robbins and Rose Hill and Hills View and in the lower part of Robbins. A developer might buy 582 and think to themselves, well, it's a main street, so don't tell us that a few more units is going to cause any more danger that's already there. What I would say to that is this is a delicate balance that we manage around here. You tell your kids not to, you don't let them go out by themselves. You don't let them ride their bikes down towards that intersection. You don't really like them going out there under any circumstances, because people fly up and down Robin Street all the time. And it's just, like I said, an inherently dangerous intersection and street, and we manage it. It's almost like an ecosystem. We put signs out. Some of us have those little fluorescent men that warn people to slow down, and sometimes it works, but most of the time it doesn't. And when you upset that ecosystem. You add 118 or 90 or 50 units with different people who live there and different driving abilities. There's no way to measure how people drive. And you might get someone who's not such a good driver who sees a green light going towards Blue Hill Avenue, and they see the green light of Robin Street, and they just hit the gas and they go. And like I said, it's an ecosystem. I think we're concerned is going to be upset even more so with the building of 118 units or 90 or 50. And I speak from personal experience. My own parents and an older brother of mine had their lives changed forever in an accident right there. Now it was a long time ago, but it was right through that intersection. Somebody in a big hurry went right blowing through it, hit them. My father had a broken neck. My mother had her leg crushed. She walked with a limp for the rest of her life. And my brother had 70 stitches in his face and lost all of his teeth. So for the rest of his life, he has dentures. Right? And like I said, my mother limped, and my father, he had a broken neck that healed, but it wasn't the same for them after that. And those of us who live here are concerned when you talk about putting up a superstructure like this, that it's going to further endanger our children. And that's what we're worried about. It's not traffic delay. It's none of that. It's the safety that we live here. We manage it. We invest our life savings in living here. And again, I understand that Joe Tamposi and Mr. Schomer, the people of goodwill, but I'm not sure they quite get that. And so I think the board realizes that, but I wanted to articulate it a little bit. And I do thank you folks for letting me speak up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mulligan. Anybody else would like to be heard by the board tonight?
The McGraths were on. Oh, here they are. The McGraths.
Hello, this is Michael McGrath.
Mr.
McGrath. Just in regard to traffic, specifically Robin Street. I know Amy, my wife, had mentioned, probably three Zoom calls back that I've been on one particular meeting with Chase Berkeley and Mike Dennehy in regards to the speed on Robin Street. So I think it'd be smart for, Tamposi's traffic engineer to coordinate with Chase and Michael in regards to the traffic speed issue there on Robin Street. Quickly, in regards to, the sight lines, I think it may have been, listening to a traffic study engineer reminds me of reading wind reports for Cape winds and vineyard wind. And intermittent wind seems to be a strategy that it's intermittent, and all of a sudden it's a science. I look at the traffic studies and I listen, and it's just like a wind study. It's all made up in formulas. Basically, what I'm asking is the sight lines to me, are there trucks, tractor trailers, buses in that sight line? How do you equate for that? There's between 130 and 150 students, children, toddlers at the Delphi. And when Mr. Dirk says that there's a good shoulder, basically where the cars can eke out a little bit onto the shoulder to improve their sight line. So when you have a bus there, a northeast storm of 8 inches, 10 inches of snow, and the children are trying to get into school, and you have this minor gridlock at 8 o'clock in the morning, I just don't see how the math of doing these sight lines and formulas, how they add up.
Mr. Dirk, do you want to address that briefly?
So I think when the applicant prepares the sightline profile plans, will clearly have something that, as you said, rather than relying upon studies and formulas as such, you're going to have it in black and white. So we'll all be able to see what the sight lines look like at the driveway. So I think that's kind of the first thing. That'll be some homework that's coming in. And I think that'll, rather than listening to me or to the applicant's traffic engineer, you'll be able to see these on plans. So I think that's kind of the first thing. So we'll wait to see what that looks like. The issue with regards to snow windrows and piles next to the driveway, I mean, that's one of the things as you look at our comments on the site plans, we've asked that they provide a note on the plan that says that has to be removed. So the idea there being that, those conditions you described are something that at least to the extent that the town approves the project, there's an enforceable condition in there that says that those snow piles can't be there. So that will deal with at least the sight lines that might be impeded by snow piles. With regards to the, if traffic is backed up across the driveway, then I think one of the things to look at is, obviously the traffic in that shoulder area, if it's not moving, it's certainly going extremely slow. And so the sight lines that were being talked about for high-speed traffic, let's say 43 miles an hour on Blue Hill Avenue, when there's congestion, those conditions, and as you heard, with the traffic volumes being down low and people driving faster, when it's congested, people can't drive that fast. So the conditions you talked about with congestion blocking the driveway, you also have reduced travel speeds. So that sight line, and in fact, the vehicle maneuvers exiting the property everything's going to be done in a much slower manner just because of the congestion that's happening. But, the key thing for safety is that everybody can see each other and understand what each other is doing. Where safety becomes an issue is where you've got high-speed traffic interacting with low-speed traffic. And so that's where you want to have those maximum sight lines.
Thank you, Mr. Dirk. Mr. McGrath.
So remember, it's Route 138. So you're going to have the state's plow in front of the building for a bus to park to pick up students. And we're 300 feet from an intersection light to Robin Street. So you saying these people are only going to do a right turn only, or these sight lines are going to be so they can creep out into the shoulder and then have the ability to creep further, to look right, to see if there's oncoming traffic, to take a left, or are they going to just be able to go right and then go down Robin Street? That's what I completely 100% disagree with you that somebody's going to maintain Route 138 from the snow plowing. We don't even have a snow plow management. Well, the applicant does not have a snow plow management team or plan to remove snow from the site. Who's going to remove the snow from Route 138? So Delphi Academy can operate their school. I don't think people realize how much of an impediment this development is going to do to the Delphi students and the people that have served that school for 15, 20 years. There'll be a letter coming from the Delphi, an objection to the entire development. So to think we're going to be able to mitigate students going into the Delphi, and we can't even figure out where they're going to enter and egress the applicant's development. And we're talking about, we have sight lines, they're going to work on Route 138. So I'll move on from there quickly. So my biggest concern, I guess, it has to do with traffic in the parking garage. So we're talking about now where we're going to have a community working group to talk about shingles, hardy plank, the color of the trim to make it, more friendly to the neighborhood. At the end of the day, we have a 57,000 square foot hole in the ground for a parking garage. For the life of me, we're in a single family zoning, and we're talking about maybe lowering the density of the building. How do you lower the density of the building when you really have no idea the drainage runoff? You're taking a 57,000 square foot hole in the ground to excavate. And then you're going to come back, Mr. Dirk, and you're going to have to redo your sight lines, and it's going to be bringing dirt back into the property.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been discussed yet, but where the carriage house is, nobody's really looked. We've talked about the carriage house, but nobody has walked the site to the carriage house to see the dramatic drop in the material, meaning dirt, that's going to have to be brought in to bring up that bank, to even have the thought of maybe having emergency vehicle apparatuses make that turn. That turn is at the north corner where the carriage house sits today. So when Mr. Burke talks about a little wall here and there, we're going to do some block walls. My specific questions started at the first walkthrough when we were at the entrance of the Delphi, and I asked them specifically what type of retaining wall they were going to use. Do you need to get on the Delphi site? And I was basically smirked at and said no. So then we didn't have the opportunity to go to the back rear north corner, Mr. Schumer, where the carriage house is, to discuss the slope and the runoff and how you're going to construct a wall there with piles, heliac piles, or whatever type of construction management, construction engineering you need to hold the soil, to hold the wall, and then you're going to bring in tractor trailer loads of dirt to bring up the grade, to level it off in the north corner so vehicles can hook a hard right. So I believe when we have these community work sessions about the architecture of the building, there should be more in-depth plans, formulas, types of block, types of fill for compaction that's going to allow a garbage truck, any type of fire apparatus to get to the rear of the property. When we have these meetings, forgive me, we talk in such glowing terms and we're going to get to this. I can't see how we could possibly move forward. It's one step back. One person talks differently about means of egress on the north or the south, just like Mr. Mullen brought up today. And now we're back to something different. I don't see how we're not moving forward. The applicant wants to move forward so they can have closed meetings. Nothing's been resolved or made me feel more comfortable about this development. And at the end of the day, Mr. Tamposi and his development team is basically single family developers. They take a single family home and they redevelop an old architectural home, or they're making a new house in a subdivision. This development is so far out of their wheelhouse. I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry if I'm a little agitated, but I feel like we're not going anywhere. The board has been wonderful, but we're not progressing. Forgive me.
Thank you, Mr. McGrath. Anybody else wish to be heard?
No?
Okay. Let me recognize Mr. Zawinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I apologize earlier. I know you were looking for me. I had inadvertently pressed a button that I didn't know did what it did, and I couldn't hear you. So I apologize for that. I'm with you right now, though.
Great.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to. There were some questions at previous hearings that necessitated some follow-up from DPW, Fire Department, and Police Department, which I have hopefully procured some answers for. So I just wanted to convey some follow-up comments from those departments.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I spoke with Chase Berkeley, the DPW director, about the comments from the resident at 45 Alfred Road regarding the sewage backup.
Mr. Gallagher.
And so, Mr. Gallagher, that's correct. And Mr. Berkeley conveyed to me that there are no records, no work orders, no service requests for Meeting House Lane or Alfred Road related to chronic sewer backups of any kind. That's in the public right of way, in the public pipes. The only record that he was able to find is an inspection of a repair to a private sewer lateral pipe on 45 Alfred Road in April of 2018. And he suspects that was, a private pipe that failed and needed replacement. And he believes that that's the incident that Mr. Gallagher recounted to this board.
Yeah.
He also just, chatted with some longtime sewer department employees in his department, who attested to their experience that they're not aware of any chronic sewer problems in this area. And it's not an area where they receive many calls about sanitary sewer issues. I think the upshot of all of this is that Chase reasonably believes that the issue that Mr. Gallagher recounted was an issue on his property with his pipes, and that the public infrastructure has not presented a problem in the past. But he did reiterate, and this is a point that he's made from the very beginning, and I believe the board stormwater peer reviewer has also made this point, that it's important for the applicant to inspect the sewer pipe that they intend to tie into, repair it where necessary if they identify any insufficiencies, and perform a capacity analysis that the peer reviewer can check, just to make sure that, even though there haven't been issues with the public pipes in the past, we want to make sure that if we're tying into a significant new project, that there's an inspection and repairs made to make it sufficient. So that's on that issue. I spoke with, I believe it was Mr. O'Brien, who had a question about the fire apparatus responding to emergency in the parking garage. And so I asked Chief Madden to kind of describe, how his folks would respond to a fire in the parking garage. And, in any fire event where they get an alarm in a building like this, the first engine to arrive would go directly to the fire alarm control panel, which typically is near the front entrance. And that control panel will tell you where the alarm was set off. So where in the building you can reasonably expect the fire began. At which point the firefighters would take a line to wherever the fire was identified and hook it into the standpipe, which brings water throughout the building on each floor, including the garage. The upshot of all of this is that the fire apparatus would not enter the garage. It would sort of park itself, probably towards the front of the building, where that fire control panel is. And then they would bring a line to the standpipe into the garage. So they would then enter the garage on foot, essentially. And they have lines that are long enough to reach, from the standpipe, which brings water into the project to wherever the fire is. But I think to the questions that Mr. O'Brien was raising earlier, Chief Madden did reiterate the importance of access to the front of the building for the fire apparatus. And I think consequently the ability then to, leave the front of the building once the fire is out is really crucially important. And so we'll be continuing, as there are project changes to the site plan and the design of the building, we'll be continuing to monitor, the access of the fire apparatus to the front of the building. We would encourage the applicant to keep that in mind as well. And finally, we did have Chief King from the police department take a look at Mr. Dirk's report. Just in his experience as a public official and serving on the traffic commission, we always like the police chief to take a look at these things. He concurred with Mr. Dirk's report that the Robin Street Blue Hill Ave intersection needs to be analyzed. I think that's just a consensus view of everybody, that's an important aspect of this project and needs to be looked at. And again, just reiterated, the main public safety issue here, I think as both residents and Mr. Dirk and everyone has acknowledged is, the sight lines coming in and out, and just ensuring that those are sufficient and safe under all circumstances. So those are just some issues that I think were raised in previous hearings that there was a request for follow-up, and that's that. So thank you for allowing me the chance to speak here, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Zawinski. And you heard the conversation about speed on 138. When we did the traffic mitigation report, 138 is a road that we looked at. And I know we talked a lot about those solar traffic counters. I can't recall whether there are any on that road, but would you mind checking with Mr. Dennehy and seeing whether or not DPW's got something out there, or the fire or the police department?
Are you talking about like the speed radar things? Okay, I can certainly do that.
I heard Mr. Michaud about the 85th percentile, but my guess is the neighbors believe, and I seem to recall that we thought on the traffic committee that it's a little bit faster than that. It's not Randolph Avenue, but it's people are not adhering, in general, not adhering to the speed limit, and I think it's a little quicker than that, but I know they took those counts over a 48-hour period. I'd just like to see if we've got a longer period of data, maybe a little bit more recent. So if there is anything, it would be good to have that as part of this hearing. Okay.
I will follow up on that
Thank you.
and get back.
Okay, I think that concludes the board's business for tonight. Mr. Schomer, we talked last time about,
Excuse me, Jeff.
Yes.
We do have an attendee who would like to speak.
Yeah. Who was that?
Bob Wright.
Mr. Wright. Welcome to the Board of Appeals.
Hi, good evening. Thank you. I just had a real quick question. So I understand MDM has said that based on the peer suggestion that to be looking at the traffic at the intersection 138 and Robbins, but I wasn't sure, did I hear correctly that they'll be using the 2018 data? And the reason I asked the question is, I have concern about that when it comes to the time since that study and changes in traffic patterns. Particularly, Mr. Dirk mentioned regarding some of the questions on busing or the buses. People are not patient. And with the prevalence of Waze within the last 3 years, I would just ask for more recent data. I know that Waze was used by 20% of drivers in 2018. It's now 40% of drivers. So I would assume that with more people using Waze, and I say I assume, but I think I have some visual knowledge of this as well, living on Robin Street. Robin Street has become a cut through, and I've mentioned this in previous meetings. People coming from Boston trying to get over to 128, where they don't want to go through the split, they cut through Milton. When they get to Robin Street, Waze is directing them down Robbins and then down 138 instead of going up Canton Ave and sitting in that mess. And I just think that if we're using 2018 data, we're not getting the full picture. I don't know what's right, because obviously with COVID, we're not going to get a great picture of the data either. But I just wanted to confirm that that is what NBM said. They were going to use 2018 data and try to find out, is there a solution where we could get more recent, more reflective data? Maybe a traffic counter was mentioned in when you were just talking to Mr. Zawinski. But is there something that we could do to get better data than looking back to 2018 when the use of GPS was a lot lower than it is today?
Mr. Michaud.
Yes, through the chair. We are going to, in fact, we're in the process of recounting traffic at that very location. So we'll have 2021 data. We'll be able to compare that data directly to the counts that were conducted pre-COVID in 2019, October 2019. So, we'll have multiple sources of data. We did reference the 2018 data because it is already publicly available. It was conducted by an independent party, CTPS, Central Transportation Planning Staff. So it will be looked at along with the new counts and the counts that we did as part of our traffic study to really understand what the vehicle patterns are through that intersection. We know through the CTPS counts in 2018 what those volumes were on Robbins Street. 2021 will represent an update to that. So we'll look at both data sets, and that will be shared with the peer reviewer, Mr. Dirk, so that he can opine as well on the results of those counts.
Thank you. Mr. Wright?
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
No.
Okay, Mr. Schomer, back to the schedule. What is the applicant's pleasure?
Well, Mr. Chair, at the last meeting, we talked about the issue of the engineering and the updated drainage system, and the board had requested a timeline for presenting that. I'm now in a position to do that, and what I would propose is that next Tuesday's hearing be dedicated to a presentation on the revised drainage system, and that be the sole topic of discussion, unless the board has something further that they'd like to discuss In terms of the rest of this week, I'm not sure we have anything further to present. So if the board doesn't have anything else that it would like to have dedicated tomorrow and Thursday, we would respectfully request that those be canceled.
Yeah. Next Tuesday, tell me again what it was. What's the subject?
It's not available, Mr. Chair, because
Yeah. Let me get the question. Let me get the answer to the question first.
That, Mr. Chair, that would be a presentation on the revised drainage system.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's our situation, the town situation. We've double booked that. So this platform is being taken by another 40B.
Okay.
The town is in the process of obtaining another 40B, another Zoom license to accommodate the hearings. So we had a meeting where I yielded that date, anticipating that we would not need it to accommodate the other applications. So I was anticipating you wanting to reschedule this for the 2nd.
And that would be for the presentation of drainage, Mr. Chair?
Presentation of wherever it is we are in the proceeding, because the town is, the board has now presented its peer review, and we now are looking for you to respond to the peer review, respond to the materials you've heard from the neighbors and the neighbors consultants, and complete the presentation of your application with respect to the financial aspects of the application and the waivers that you've requested. So that's the remainder of at least the next phase of this hearing. So I've spent some time with the town and the other members of the 40B panels that are being heard in the town to get some dates. And what we're looking at is suspending this hearing until Tuesday, March 2nd. And then thereafter, securing the following several Wednesdays. The reason we want to do that is the town will be running multiple 40B applications at the same time in light of the time that it's taking to work through these processes. So I wonder if that works for the applicant.
It does, Mr. Chair. I think that makes a lot of sense as an approach. We were planning to present the drainage a little bit sooner than the rest of our responses to peer review, but I think it certainly makes sense to do it all at once, and that I would agree with that approach.
So we would be scheduling the 2nd, the 10th, the 17th, the 24th, the 31st, something like that.
I would just point out, Mr. Chair, the 24th, there is a hearing of a different panel of the zoning board on the 40B for 648 Canton Avenue. And that's our development team as well. That's the only conflict.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to have that hearing.
Oh,
I don't know. Maybe that's right. I don't know. I do have that as a Canton Avenue, but I'm not sure that's going to go forward based on the Wednesday approach. I don't know. Judy,
that would be fine, Mr. Chair. Whichever panel of the board is heard that night, we'll be on Zoom either way.
So this hearing is a lot about local concern. Let me tell you what the town is trying to do. It's trying to organize these hearings because we've got multiple people watching all of the hearings, and it has been decided that the Blue Hill Avenue hearing will, provided it's acceptable to the applicant, will take the Wednesday night slot. So the town will be having Tuesday nights for another night, for another hearing, and perhaps Thursday nights for another hearing.
Right.
So that an interested citizen or a town official, like Mr. Zawinski, who needs to attend all of these, will be able to manage multiple nights. It's not ideal, but I think that that's going to best serve this particular hearing. So why don't we preserve on whether we'll schedule the 24th? But I wonder if a schedule of the 2nd, would you want to meet on the 3rd?
I would leave that up to the board. If there's if there's need for it, then we can certainly hold that date, Mr.
Well,
Chair.
it's up to you, right? So if you have something to present, this is all being driven by what I think, what we're trying to respond to what the applicant can
Yeah.
can present, you know, and I think going weekly will give us a little bit better cadence on responding to each other's proposal, you know?
Agreed,
I
100%.
propose the 2nd, the 10th, the 17th. We'll hold on the 24th for now, and then the 31st, something like that.
That makes sense. I agree with that.
Okay. Members of the board, do you have any objection?
No objections, but I do have a comment, if I may, Mr.
Ms.
Chair.
Jaffe?
So I am trying to process the impact of Mr. Boehmer's architectural peer review. And what I took from it is that he thinks the design is unacceptable and needs to be revised pretty drastically. And so I guess in my view, it's difficult for me to assess in any helpful manner details around drainage or engineering if the design itself is going to change substantially. And so I guess my comment is, for me, from my perspective, that has drastically shifted things. And what would be most helpful next is the redesign.
Yeah.
I don't know if fellow board members agree or if Ms. Barrett has an opinion, but otherwise I'm having difficulty thinking about how I can assess sort of details when the fundamental aspects may change. Thank you.
Now, I share that concern. I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect here, and it seems to me as though we probably ought to get to what is this redesign concept that we're talking about, and I know how's the board going to process that before we start talking about, you know, the drainage design for the existing project that has to change. I mean, that's just my sense, but
Mr. Schomer?
I feel like in a way it's sort of wasting the board's time.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Mr. Chair, I think that's a fair point, and I think that's why it makes all the more sense to present our responses to all the peer review at one meeting, because as Ms. Joffer and as Ms. Barrett were saying, if the project is changing significantly, that will have an impact on the drainage system as well.
So that then raises the issue of there's another peer review coming. And I don't know how we fit this into the schedule. Do you want me to address that now, Mr. Chair, or not?
Yeah.
So Mrs. Lyon will be able to present her review, if not the written report, then at least her findings to the board in the middle of March, but cannot get to it until then. People are just all very busy. So that's just the added, I think, concern we have, is that we kind of want to have all the peer reviews together before you kind of march off in a certain direction with 3 of them, and then perhaps have that affected by a 4th that you haven't heard yet.
Okay, let's do this. When we ask our landscape architecture peer review, the woman, Ms. Lyons, see if she'd be available on, is it Wednesday? Is it March 17th?
Yeah, I've actually been trying to get hold of her this evening. I just haven't been able to reach her.
That's okay. Let's just see if that will do. And then what we'll do is we will recess this hearing until Tuesday, March 2nd, at
Mhm.
which point we'll hear from Mr. Schumer about the status of the application. And request that he respond to the board's desire to hear from on the site plan, I mean, the peer review on basic design, before we get too far down the road on some of the other elements. As much as stormwater is important, I do agree with Ms. Joffer that we've got to get the basic design at least conceptualized before we go forward on that. So that we'll hear from you on Tuesday, March 2nd on those matters, and then with the Wednesday scheduling in mind, we'll try to schedule proceedings to accommodate the application the town's review of the application, the citizens' feedback in the application, and a workshop on the design. All which is in our future. Is that sound right, members of the board?
Excuse me, Jeff.
Yes.
The McGraths are back on again. I don't know. Their mic is off and their hand is up.
Okay, we'll recognize the McGraths. Let me just try to get an answer from the question I asked the board members.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Yes, Mr. Chair, that sounds right to me.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay, Mr. McGrath.
Just a quick question in regards to the intersection at Canton for MDM. So when you do your updated analysis, you had Reebok that was there. You have Dunkin' Donuts and all the office developments that are down that street. I forget the name of it. There has to be.
Dan Road.
Thank you. There has to be, Reebok's 100% vacant. The
Yeah.
Dunkin' Donuts, I forget the building next to that, it's on the highway, that's 100% vacant. What I'm getting at is there must be 2,000 car, there's got to be a capacity there for, I'll say 1,500 car parking garages that are vacant right now. So for the future studies and analysis and formulas that you're going to put together, I understand there isn't any future development, but there's 300,000, 500,000 square foot buildings down in that area that are vacant right now. 100% vacant. So will that be in the future? Will that be part of your calculations of traffic? Or I would just like it to be known on the record that that intersection should be part of the traffic study for the shortcuts through Robin Street, down through by Houghton's Pond. That's all, just for the record. And I'm sorry, it's been a long night for everybody.
I don't know, Mr. Michaud, I don't, it doesn't seem proximate to the locus, but I don't know if you want to address that. Do you know where we're speaking?
I think the reference point here is Canton Avenue and developments along the Canton Avenue corridor that may be vacant and reoccupied at some point. Is that what I'm hearing?
No.
No, Mr. McGrath was speaking about a site in Canton.
Yeah.
At the intersection of 138 and 128 Dan Road, where Amazon's going.
Right.
The Reebok facility. So there's quite a bit of space in that location. The question is whether or not that would be reflected in your traffic report. I believe that's the question.
We'll certainly take that under advisement. The process that we've used to estimate future year traffic conditions is to look at growth patterns, historic growth patterns that have occurred over the quarter. And in fact, the Route 138 quarter study itself used the same process of looking forward and understanding how traffic might grow over time. We apply the same methodology. That methodology was the subject of the peer review. And I think there's concurrence that the approach that we've taken to date follows an industry standard. It looks at those historic patterns. So we'll certainly take your comment under advisement as we look forward. But I don't know that we're necessarily going to significantly increase volume conditions beyond what we've already looked at, but we will certainly take it under advisement.
Thank you, Mr. Michaud.
Thank you.
On the scheduling, on the 2nd of March, Mr. Schomer, we'll want to hear back from you on where you are with respect to the various things that are on the table and to which you will respond. We'll also expect to hear testimony from you on the status of the design of the project. To the extent that you have a particular subject that you're going to address, I'd ask that you let the board know so that we can let the public know. And thereafter, we'll meet on March 10th, 17th, potentially the 24th and the 31st for your planning purposes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That makes sense as an approach. I will be asking my entire development team to be on the Zoom on the meeting on the 7th. And my hope is that we'll be able to provide comprehensive responses to all of the peer review, town comments, and the board's questions and concerns.
Thank you. Ms. Baptista, is there anything you'd like to add or respond to at this point?
No, I'm all set. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, unless there's other business for the board, we'll be in recess until Tuesday, March 2nd, 7 o'clock. Thank you all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.